to Shut In, Shut Out, Shut Up, Neurodiversity, Church and Intersectionality. It's great to have you with us. I'm Fiona MacMillan. I'm a disability advocate, practitioner, speaker and writer. I chair the Disability Advisory Group at St Martin in the Fields, and I'm a trustee of Inclusive Church. Since 2012, I've been helping to shape an annual conference as a space for disabled and neurodivergent people to gather to resource each other and the church. In this HeartEdge series, we're sharing some of this experience, exploring issues and ideas across current practice and systemic barriers, outmoded belief and cutting-edge thinking. Today's the fifth in our series of conversations, and I'm delighted to welcome as my guest the Revd Bingo Allison. Sadly, my other guest, Anne Mehmet, is unable to be with us today, but we're pleased to still be sharing some of her ideas. In a moment, we'll be talking about today's topic, but first let me say something about how the session will work. Then I'll introduce the subject and the speaker. If you'd like to, please do introduce yourselves in the chat. Perhaps say who you are and where you're joining from. The first half of our conversation, from now until about 5:15, will be input. So Bingo and I will have a conversation and we'll share some of the themes and ideas and experience of the day. Then from then on, we each have a chance to share experience and ideas. Firstly, we'll move into small breakout groups for around 10 minutes or so, and then come back for a plenary discussion and questions. We'll end with some last thoughts, resources, and signposts to future events. This session will be recorded and will be put on the HeartEdge Facebook page. We record in speaker view, so you shouldn't show up unless you say something, but please do feel free to turn off your video if you don't want to be seen in the recording. To ensure the quality of sound on the recording, please stay on mute unless you've been invited to speak, but obviously not in the small groups. Another reason we keep the microphones on mute is because some of us are sensitive to sound. I'm very distracted by also being host and having the people in the waiting room appear in front of me as well. We keep the mics on mute because some of us are sensitive to sound, including me. I have Tourette's, and some sounds set off physical and verbal tics. These are involuntary movement sounds and words, which include plenty of swear words at the moment. I'll do my best to hold them in because it can be less painful and will probably make the session go a lot more smoothly, but it's not always possible. In the same way that you can't hold in a sneeze or a cough. And it's important that I come as I am, tics, Tourette's and all. I hope you will also be comfortable to come as you are too. So let's begin by defining our terms. Neurodiversity and intersectionalities are ways of describing particular identity and experience. We each have names, descriptions, roles and relationships which relate to our sense of self, our roles, our ways of being in the world. These affect how we see ourselves, how we are seen, and also shape our power and our influence in different contexts. We each see ourselves as complex beings, but somehow we see each other as simple labels. For example, I use a wheelchair to get around. I live with daily pain and fatigue, with sensory hypersensitivity, with tics and spasms. After years of painful spasms, my bendy joints are wearing out way before their time. So I describe myself as disabled and neurodivergent. I also describe myself as a Celt, a Londoner, a middle-aged redhead, a writer, a contemplative, a knitter of hats. I wonder how you describe yourself and what it feels like when you're reduced to one word. As I mentioned earlier, I have Tourette's, and Tourette's is a part of a group of things called neurodiversity. Neurodiversity is the idea that there are naturally different ways of being in the world, different ways of thinking, understanding, feeling, and sensing. These include Tourette's and also autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia. Neurodiversity sees these differences rather than deficits, but as distinct ways of being, which shape our identities and relationships and life experience. Intersectionality is the idea that these different identities can multiply and increase exclusion. Intersectionality is rooted in the idea that there's a standard way of being in the world or in a culture, and that those whose experience is different from that, they have different ways of being in the world, are deviant. They have less power, less opportunity, less privilege. It's a term coined by the US academic and lawyer Kimberly Crenshaw, and is a way of describing the multiple disadvantages affecting Black women. That privilege and marginalization can occur in the same group. For example, Black women find themselves excluded from the women's movement because it's primarily run by white women, and from the racial justice movement by virtue of their gender, where their experience is not understood or reflected. The term intersectionality, the experience and the thought, seeks to make sense of the experience of those who live at the intersections where different disadvantages meet. For example, race, poverty, class, education, disability, and neurodivergence. Rather than add, intersectionality suggests that different forms of discrimination, such as sexism and racism, can overlap and compound each other. So today we'll be exploring neurodiversity and intersectionality in the context of faith and church. I'm delighted to be joined by the Reverend Bingo Allison to explore these and other ideas. Bingo is the curate of St Margaret of Antioch Church, Toxteth in Liverpool. They run groups and retreats for LGBT+ and neurodivergent folk, and write and speak on gender identity, neurodiversity, and the church. Bingo was recently ordained priest. We believe they are the first out, non-binary person to be ordained priest in the Church of England. Bingo's now going to give us an outline of their life and work and touch on something of their experience of church, gender, and disability. Bingo, you're so welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, it's so great to be here. I always love to talk about disability and gender and kind of my experience in the theology and things that kind of grow out of that. As Fiona said, I am a non-binary person. That means that if there's a census and it says, are you male or female? I want to find an other box and tick that instead. So for some non-binary people, there's a kind of sense of there's a sort of line and they're on somewhere on the line. But for me, it's much more other than that. I'm sort of yeah, my gender is something that doesn't really relate to traditional understandings of man and woman. I'm also autistic, and I have dyspraxia and also chronic pain, which may or may not be related to hypermobility. But it's very exciting juggling all those labels. And I grew up in quite a conservative evangelical wing of the church. And so my journey of faith through those different intersecting identities has been a difficult one and a complicated one. And I still carry some of the weight and the kind of worldview that background comes, but also so much of my work has been about growing beyond that and rebuilding my faith to be something more encouraging and more encouraging more growth and more love in my life. I I guess I came out as autistic before I came out as non-binary. And so, yeah, I was thinking about this the other day, and I think I've been involved in disability advocacy and activism since I think about nearly 15 years now. It's so, yeah, I'm a senior disabled person in that respect. um, but yeah, and I'm really really, I always say it's disability theology that broke me out of my the kind of prison of my background, the kind of yeah, it's disability theology that brought me beyond the very black and white, very restrictive theology that I'd been brought up in. One of the things I've written quite a bit about is how autistic people read and understand the Bible, and also liturgy, and kind of really, I'm really passionate about reading the Bible with neurodivergent people, and finding ways for people to identify themselves in Scripture. And so that's been a really important thing. And so when it came to coming out as non-binary, I already had the tools to look at Scripture and look at narratives particularly, and see someone like me, and see people who lived beyond strict definitions of maleness and femaleness, man and woman. And so, yeah, it's really disability theology that sort of saved me from a lot of more harmful theologies. And I wouldn't have come out, and I wouldn't have been able to embrace who I am as a trans person without disability theology. So it's yeah, everything about how I understand my my nature as a non-binary person comes from my what I understand about who I am as an autistic person and who I am as a disabled person. I have had some really varied experiences of church. I am now ordained in the Church of England. It's been a long and complicated journey to get here, but we're finally kind of on it. If anyone wants to give me a job, that would be great, because I'm about to finish my curacy, and yeah, that would be lovely. But yeah, and one of the things I've been involved in is fresh expressions of church, and seeing how kind of new and creative ways of doing church can kind of open a door for lots of different people with lots of intersecting identities. My church, the Order of the Black Sheep, that I worked for up until recently, we worked it out, and we reckoned about 75% of our congregation were neurodivergent, and there were lots of reasons for that. It was originally set up as a church to help people who were dealing with religious trauma, and who felt excluded from normal church, quote unquote. So there were things that we didn't have as a church. We didn't have singing, and we didn't have preaching in the way that you might understand it. We did have communion, but not probably in a way that you might normally expect it. And we used lots of video and lots bringing in different voices from different sections of society and things. And surprise, surprise, when you provide that kind of space for people with trauma around church, surprise, surprise, there are quite a lot of disabled people who've had quite a lot of trauma around church, and there are quite a lot of LGBT people who've had quite a lot of trauma around church, and you kind of the welcome got bigger and bigger, and I'm very proud of that church. But I'm also proud of the church that I'm working for now, which is, on the face of it, the most kind of traditional looking Anglican church. We prance around in robes and swing incense about and fun things like that. But also there is this wonderful, relaxed attitude to everything that's done, so that everyone feels that they can get involved. Everyone is accepted as who they are, and it's a wonderfully inclusive church, and not just inclusive of people's identities, but also inclusive of different people's abilities. And we had our first streamed service for the second lockdown last week, and one thing went wrong, and my vicar said, well, it wouldn't really be St. Margaret's. I think we'd all feel very uncomfortable if nothing at all went wrong. So yeah, it's that kind of church where actually it's okay for me to show up and be stimming in the pulpit and be kind of, and it's okay that some of us fall over sometimes, and it's okay that we drop flammable things, and just that kind of atmosphere actually really encourages inclusivity and friendship. So yeah, so that's kind of my experience. Also, since coming out, I've been involved in LGBT communities, and I run a non-binary Christians blog, and produce a lot of liturgy, reflections, things like that for non-binary Christians, really about kind of doing the same sort of thing as I've been doing with autistic readings of the Bible, really encouraging non-binary Christians to look at their scripture and see themselves and see things about them, and not just things about other people. So yeah.
Genius. Thank you, Bingo. That's a wonderful introduction to something of who you are and your current ministry. So that's kind of the introductions. Let's think a little bit perhaps about the context for this conversation. And today could not be more poignant in terms of where this conversation comes, certainly for people in the Church of England. This week saw the publication by the Church of England of the resource Living in Love and Faith, Christian Teaching and Learning about Identity, Sexuality, Relationships and Marriage. Living in Love and Faith explores traditional church teaching, what's going on in the contemporary world, attitudes to gender, sexuality and marriage. It outlines what modern science can teach about gender and sexuality. It encourages reflection, listening and discernment to work out where we are in God's story. It asks who is not in the room and what we can learn from each other. Monday of next week is the Trans Day of Remembrance, a day set aside to grieve for the loss of people from the transgender and non-binary community, and to reflect on the violence commonly perpetrated against them. Into that context, I'd like to read you something of Anne Mehmet's blog on autism, Christianity, LGBTQ, why it's important, safeguarding and caring. Anne writes, there are different beliefs about God and what God thinks of LGBT+ people. In the Church of England, it's still a difficult subject for some, though recent research shows that the number who are, for example, against equal marriage has dropped a lot in recent years. There are huge differences in the answers given by people of different ages. Below age 34, most Church of England people are fine with equal marriage, but over 55, a majority are not. That opposition from the over 55s is dropping too. But of course, in many churches, most people are over age 55. And most powerful people in churches are over 55. So we have a church where it's been difficult and sometimes dangerous to be openly gay in some places, where it's been acceptable to be called all sorts of unpleasant things and told just to forgive. What we also know is that when people get to know, for example, a gay or lesbian married couple living ordinary lives, doing ordinary things like everyone else, as neighbours, work colleagues and friends, they usually can't remember what they were objecting to. Anne writes, about 3 in every 100 people are autistic. So that's about 2 million in the UK. At least 3 out of every 10 autistic people are lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, non-binary, queer, asexual, intersex, etc. In other words, part of the LGBTQ population. The figure for autistic females is higher at around half. So that's around 600,000 autistic people who are part of the LGBT+ community in the UK. Autistic people are as likely to be Christian as anyone else, as likely to be churchgoers, church leaders, musicians, organists, treasurers, youth workers. We make it so awful for people, though, that when they disclose they're autistic, we force them into hiding. Now, we have a genuine bit of thinking to do here as a church, because we also know that autistic people are often a vulnerable population, with a suicide rate 9 times higher than others, dying on average at age 54 after a lifetime of difficulties caused by society. Many are homeless, have been denied jobs. They are routinely targeted for bullying, ostracism, fraud, and every other kind of crime. We know that the rates of targeting for sexual assault are sky high. 3 out of every 10 autistic women are victims of rape. Some 6 out of 10 are likely to be diagnosable as having trauma conditions after what has happened to them. So these are not angry activists or dangerous, toxic people storming the gates of church. Many are understandably fearful of the people around them, and for good reasons. Most communicate using a different body language and spoken method to neurotypical people, which so often leads to misunderstandings between the two cultures, the autistic and the non-autistic. If half of autistic women are part of the LGBTQ communities struggling to survive, what is our response to those tens of thousands in our parishes? Is our response to lock the church door in their faces, or to bring them in for condemnation? To leave them to the nearest predator in the church to prey on? Or to describe in medicalized phrases? Or put a £5 in the collection box for some autism charity and hope God approves? Is that what God has asked us to do? Or is that bread and wine for all who want to follow Jesus in love? If wanting a safe church for autistic people leads people to see Anne as a warrior, that's okay. But it's not a war she brings, it's fellowship. And maybe that's the same thing that people fear most. Because to make our churches a safe place where all belong takes acknowledgement of the fear of difference. And that's a very hard thing to do. Bingo. I'd like to call on you to share something of your perspective on current church practices and how they create systemic barriers. And perhaps talk a little bit more about your experience of fresh expression and a much more neurodivergent friendly church.
Brilliant. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think we've all experienced that sense of being defined by one thing. You know, if you're you know, if you're gay, you're the that gay couple, or you know, if you're in a wheelchair, you are. Fiona and I were joking. It's a bit like saying, "Oh, that person who wears shoes," you know, or "Oh, that person who always wears a shirt." The person in the wheelchair. It's your one thing. And I think a lot of the time churches really want to welcome people, but can only really keep one thing in their head. You know, it's like someone comes through their door and it's like, they are the person who is autistic. Okay. It's going to take some hard work, but maybe we can just about get our heads round adapting and embracing an autistic person in our congregation. But wait a minute, they don't just have one thing. They have two things, or maybe even three things. You know, they're an autistic person who is also trans, or they're an autistic person who is also experiencing poverty, and suddenly their one thing becomes a two thing. And as Anne points out, actually, the likelihood is that there will be more than one thing. If they're, for example, you know, a lot of trans people are autistic or neurodivergent. This is not to say that autism or neurodivergence somehow causes you to be transgender, although there would be no problem at all if it was. But I like to think of it as that autistic people are less tied down by social rules. And so we're more likely to realize that we're trans, and we're more likely to want to do something about it. So actually, you're quite likely to have people come through your churches who have more than one thing. And the problem, a lot of the multiplication of disadvantage and oppression in our churches comes through people only focusing on one thing. So, for example, you know, I'm trying to think of a good one. So, for example, an autistic person who expresses gender in a different way to a non-autistic person. it will be very hard for people who don't fully embrace both aspects, both them being transgender and them being autistic, to understand that they are expressing their gender in a neurodivergent way, but that doesn't make their gender any less valid or true. So, you know, a autistic transgender person might not express their gender so someone like me, for example, might not express the hyper femininity that you'd want from a trans woman. And so it suddenly becomes, for sensory reasons, you know, putting makeup on feels really weird. Wearing some clothes that's traditionally seen as feminine kind of feels weird and has some weird textures and has some odd feels about it. And so if you choose to just wear baggy clothes and no makeup and you know, maybe not shave, then your not only your gender will be read and understood incorrectly in churches, but it will also be the way that you express your gender through your autistic worldview will be misunderstood. Another thing that's often, I'm not a big fan of speaking on behalf of people whose groups I'm not part of, and but with a platform like this, I think it's important to understand the experiences of Black autistic and neurodivergent people that actually a lot of the time Black neurodivergent people's behaviors are read as more aggressive, are read as more disruptive, are read by people in society more negatively because of their Blackness. And it's only by embracing the whole person and not trying to distill them down into one thing that we can actually break down some of these barriers and embrace and include other people. Another, you know, the complex relationship between womanhood and neurodivergence is, I mean, it's really only in the last 10 years that the surface of that has really started to be scratched away. The amount of pressure that has been put on young autistic women to conform to behavioral standards, and to a certain extent, the way that autistic boys have been let off and given much more freedom to express themselves. And we're starting, thankfully, to see more women, autistic women, getting the diagnoses and the support and the that they need. But that's a very recent thing, and what it really comes from is a misogyny that places far more expectations to conform on women in our society than men. And unfortunately, churches have perpetuated these things as well. And so rather than being a place of welcome and home for where these identities intersect, we have become structurally stronger supports for breaking people into these small boxes and only allowing people to have one thing, and only allowing people to have one identity. My own experience of working for the Order of the Black Sheep, it was really watching what was initially a very broad church that welcomed multiple identities really broaden even further. And what's hilarious is they started off as very, very catering to a very specific, what they felt was a very specific identity. They started off catering for people, young people who liked heavy metal music. And my vicar was and still is a member of the band Detritus, which is this amazing heavy metal band, currently touring the UK and recording their 5th or 6th studio album. But you know, started off by saying metalheads are not welcome in other churches. And so we will take this one thing and we will try and provide a space to welcome these people and make them feel at home. Of course, as soon as you start talking to metalheads as a group, you meet metalheads who are dealing with religious trauma, and actually heavy metal music is a really important outlet for a lot of people in dealing with religious trauma. So okay, so we've come across one intersection, so we'll broaden things a bit more, and we'll try and kind of make our, and they could have just said, no, we're a heavy metal church, but they said, okay, this is another thing that we need to be aware of, that we need to embrace, and that we need to accept. And so we pare back some of the more scary bits of our services and do that. Then, of course, you meet all the LGBT metalheads. Because there are loads of LGBT metalheads, because it's actually a place where you can express and play with gender and play with the way that you present yourself. And, you know, everyone's got long hair and everyone's got makeup on, and it's, you know, and so, of course, you expand, you meet another intersection and you meet another place where identities overlap. And in doing that, you create a space that is not only welcoming to metalheads, you create a space that is welcoming to metalheads, LGBT people, metalhead or otherwise, and you create a space where the intersections of the heavy metal subculture and people with religious trauma, and so the conversation gets wider and wider and wider, and people don't have one thing, but they have multiple things. And to the point today, 7 years on, I think they've been going for 7 years, actually, quite a few of our metalheads have gotten older and they've had children, and they've kind of, you know, put away their battle vest maybe and you know, settled down a bit. But what you have is a community where these intersections are embraced, they're encouraged, they're welcomed, and the children of metalheads are another intersection. And we, you know, we have LGBT people who aren't metalheads, but who come to the church because, not because of the metalheads, but they come to the church because it's the only place in for miles around where they can feel at home. And as we include more and more voices into the conversation, so one of the things that's really important about our services at Order of the Black Sheep is we include a lot of video, and a lot of the video is to bring in voices from other parts of the community that are not necessarily represented in the congregation. And so one of my proudest moments as a trainee vicar was doing a service based around the three wise men and drag, and how and how really the whole point of the gifts that the three wise men give is that it's amplifying and celebrating part of Jesus's identity. And drag is also about amplifying and celebrating part of your identity, be it femininity in drag queens or masculinity in drag kings. And it's only by not just bringing my voice, but bringing in the voices of, you know, we had a video of a plus size pole dancer talking about her experience as a Black woman and as a plus size pole dancer, and how celebrating who she was and amplifying and celebrating who that was. And we had, you know, various videos from various drag queens and things. Allowing those voices to be heard actually encouraged them to be heard, other people to feel confident in sharing. So yeah, I think it doesn't all have to be like the Order of the Black Sheep, although I love them, because actually I go to now work for a very normal and very normal. I go, you know, it's a very traditional looking church, but it's a traditional looking church where everything we do celebrates and includes as many of those intersections of identity that we can find. And I think the Bible's very good at that too. You know, none of the characters that Jesus meets along the road have one thing about them. They're very well-rounded, considering they're such short stories. You know, we hear of the woman at the well, and the fact that Jesus knows everything about her, it's because there's more than one thing about her. She isn't just a woman, and she isn't just someone who is poor, and she isn't just someone who has had several husbands. She isn't just someone who has experienced grief. She is several things, and these are all intersecting and crossing over. And so when we talk about neurodivergence, none of us is just neurodivergent. None of us, and a lot of my things I've done around reading Jesus as autistic and reading Jesus as non-binary in the Bible and things is that doesn't take away from all the other things that Jesus is, but it allows us to see these intersections, see these places where things overlap.
Amen. Alleluia. Seeing the places where things overlap and one identity not precluding another. Those seem like very radical thoughts to be thinking in the context of a conversation that's thinking about church. So we're now moving into that section of the session where we get a chance to speak to each other. Again, in a moment, we're going to pop you over into small groups. These are groups of 3 or 4 people. It's a chance to share your experience and ideas, and we'll give you a loose framework to do that. Just a loose framework. So use what's useful and don't use what's not. So you could perhaps think about what has resonated from this conversation so far today. What ideas have resonated? What struck you? What shocked or surprised you about the ideas we've been talking about so far today? What do you think about the idea? Perhaps I wonder what it'd be like to be reduced to one label, to one measure of your identity. And if you were called by that one measure or that one label, how that would feel. Perhaps what would be lost not only of your experience of yourself, but also of your faith. If your faith was predicated around one label, one measure of identity, What might that feel like? And so we're going to move into small groups for about just over 10 minutes to give you a chance to have a bit of a conversation. And then we'll come back together and we'll have a chance to share experience and ideas and ask questions. Things we haven't managed to say, you didn't manage to say earlier, things that you've heard or reflected on today, or things that you'd like people to take away as their kind of thought as they go. Can't find you now, Bingo. Where have you gone?
Here I am.
Oh, there you are. Yeah. You keep moving around. Ill.
I mean, the real thing I want people to take away from this is to reflect on it, not just in terms of the surface level, what can my church do, but also what can our churches be thinking, because reflecting theologically on identity is really important. Reading the Bible through the lens of intersecting identities is really important. Yes, I would really love for every church to be as welcoming and intersectional as some of the churches that I've got to be in, but there is hard but wonderful and creative and beautiful theological work to be done. That actually God is much more than one thing. And so when we are reading and thinking about God, our theology needs to be richer than that. Our theology needs to bring different voices together, and not just our own, but those of different intersecting identities.
Thank you. Such wisdom. Thank you, Bingo. Thank you so much for being with us today and sharing some of your pioneering work, cutting edge ideas and embodied experience, and for dealing with all the changes that we've had in the run up to today as well. It's been really wonderful to have you with us, and I hope good luck in the looking for the new role. Thank you to all of you for being here today. None of us have all the answers, which is why these conversations are so helpful, especially at a time when we're more divided than ever, and we perhaps can tend to polarize in both our experience and in our thinking. I hope today has informed or encouraged you. If you'd like to dive a little deeper into the ideas that we've shared, we've put an awful lot of things in the chat. If you'd like to save the chat, do click on those 3 dots. The resources that we've recommended today, we will save and put onto the HeartEdge website, so you can go and find the same articles and books and links that we've talked about today. We'll be back next week for the last conversation in this current series. Our guest speakers, Naomi Lawson-Jacobs and Krisha Waldock, will be leading us in an exploration of disability, church and social justice. This series is one among many treasures hidden in the secret place of HeartEdge online series, Living God's Future Now. Ben has listed quite a lot of them in the chat, of the things coming up very soon, because HeartEdge is a very full and rich programme. I draw your attention particularly to the great weekly series Being Interrupted, reimagining the church's mission from the outside. There are many parallels with the conversations and theologies emerging among disabled and neurodivergent people. There's a rich resource of previous conversations held on the HeartEdge Facebook page. Strongly recommend it as a place to go for other cutting edge conversations. It would keep you away from TV for the next 6 months. But we'll be sharing resources from today on the chat and from all the conversations in this series. If you like what HeartEdge are doing and would like to be part of this church renewal through compassion, culture, commerce and congregation, do join the HeartEdge network or sign up for the monthly mailer or even for the weekly mailer. Thank you again to Bingo and to all of you for being part of this conversation today. Hope to see you again. Bye-bye.